following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatis, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Jacques Barzun, one of the most influential historians of the 20th century, once noted that whoever wants to know the heart and mind of baseball the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball, the rules and realities of the game. Indeed, baseball and American culture enjoy a symbiotic relationship that can be seen throughout our nation's history, from civil rights to labor relations to democracy itself. No institution tells that story better than the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Library in Cooperstown, New York. There, among the scuffed baseballs, gritty photographs, and polished bronze plaques that immortalize our childhood heroes, visitors can learn about the American experience with all its glories and achievements, flaws, and shortcomings. John Odell, Curator of History and Research at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, has been telling the story of the inextricable bond between baseball and America since 1999. He has served as lead curator for such permanent exhibitions as Diamond Dreams, which explores women in baseball, Viva Baseball, chronicling the Latin American experience and their influence on the game, and A Whole New Ball Game, a multimedia exhibit that explores the last half-century of baseball and some of the game's most iconic moments. Odell earned a graduate degree in museum studies at George Washington University and did his undergraduate work in history at Davidson College. Prior to his arrival at Cooperstown, he served for more than a decade in the United States Senate Curator's office in Washington, D.C., where he was registrar and collections manager. And before that, John was a National Park Service ranger at Independence Park in Philadelphia, where we met each other in the 1980s, and at Colonial National Historical Park in Jamestown, Virginia. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Hey, Bill. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Let's begin with your background. When and how did you fall in love with baseball?
Well, I fell in love with baseball, as so many do, with an intergenerational thing. I grew up in Newport News, Virginia. The local Class A affiliate for the Philadelphia Phillies was the club that was down there, the Peninsula Pilots, and there's an old ballpark down there, War Memorial Stadium, that I used to be taken to regularly by my dad, but especially by my granddad. And so summers, many summer evenings were spent at this little bandbox ballpark, and when the great thing about it was that this was back in the 1970s, and baseball, minor league baseball, had not grown to what it is now. And, I could go there and I could stay for as long as my, 6 or 7 or 5-year-old self could handle it, and then walk around a little bit and then come back and watch some more of the game. So it was really able to take it on my ability. And as I got older, of course, got a chance to go to more games and to be able to understand the game better. But it was that direct connection with live baseball that really cemented it for me. Never cared too much for it on the on TV, but going to a live baseball game has always been just a terrific thing for me.
Now, you're talking about the Peninsula Pilots of the Philadelphia Phillies in the 70s. Did many of the future Phillies, players who made it up to Philadelphia, did you see any of them when you were playing?
I did. Juan Samuel was one of the ones who played down with Philadelphia, or down with Peninsula, and there were some others too that I will recall as we're chatting here, but I don't recall them right off the top of my head. I was aware, however, that one of the talks that would happen in the ballpark was, this kid is going to the bigs, or he's got a chance. It was definitely the atmosphere that you were watching people, young men who were in progress, and some of them would progress themselves all the way out of baseball, but a few of them would progress themselves up to the higher minors, and then ultimately to the major leagues.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you play Little League Baseball, John?
I did, and that was about the level at which I could handle it. After I played in my hometown, I also played for a church league team. But about the time that I got to be 13 years old, I realized that my love for the game exceeded my talent for the game, and so I stopped playing baseball. But I always enjoyed going to it.
Well, it's interesting. One of the most humbling experiences that I had was in college. I went to a small Division III school out in Richmond, Indiana, and the baseball team wasn't that good, but we did have a prospect, a pitching prospect, who would actually only attend school during the spring semester because he was a farm boy, and if he played baseball, he knew he had a shot at being looked at by the St. Louis Cardinals or the Reds, who were the chief clubs that sent scouts out there. And Red Chaindienst at the time, in one of his various incarnations with the Cardinals, came and looked at him. And rather jokingly, I went up to him before one practice, and I said, hey, Red, can you give me a look-see? So we sat through the practice, and afterwards I went up to him and I said, so tell me, what'd you see? And he was just sitting and looking in the distance, puffing on a cigarette, and didn't even look at me. He said, well, you can't hit, you can't field, you can't run, you can't throw, but you really like baseball, don't you? I said, yeah. He said, well, you ever consider writing about it? And that was pretty much it for me, but he gave me my career. I mean, that's what I ended up doing. And it's at that moment that I realized that sooner or later the game tells everyone that it has no more use for them as a player. But when that time comes, it's time to find another outlet for the talents that we have. So what led you to American history?
Well, growing up in Tidewater, Virginia, and I imagine this is probably true of, all around everybody, but it seemed like there was history all around. It was about a half hour away from Yorktown, 45 minutes from Jamestown and Williamsburg. It was wonderful to be able to just go out and see these places, and they were very exciting for me, and to do two things. One of them was to go, for instance, to Yorktown Battlefield, the actually Revolutionary War battlefield, but with many people don't realize that there's the embankments that are there are all from the Civil War. They just rebuilt what had been built during the Revolutionary War, and we could just play on them. And the two things merged in my mind, that history could be fun, and that there was an engaging part of history that linked the fun stuff of history with the place of history, and I just found it fascinating. The same thing true at Jamestown and up at Williamsburg. So growing up in that area, it was very much alive to me. In the words of Faulkner, it's history's not dead. So for me, it was not dead. It isn't even past, and it wasn't past. You could go there and you could feel, like what it was like to stand on top of the readouts at Yorktown and just look out and go, I can't believe how close these guys were. So that was the kind of thing that animated my love of history. Loved it through high school, got to college, took no history for the first year and a half because I wanted to try everything else. After a year and a half, I said, nope, history is it. And so for the last part of my college career, just focused on history. And then the greatest thing happened after I graduated, and it was that I found out that the National Park Service liked having people who loved history being a part of them. And so I had the opportunity to work first at Yorktown Battlefield first as a volunteer and then as a seasonal ranger, where I found out that this was terrific stuff. I could play with history, I could work with history, and I didn't have to go back to school to get a master's degree or a doctorate degree in order to do it. And so then was fortunate enough to be able to move up for a permanent position at Independence National Historical Park, where I stayed several years. And but that's how I became engaged first with history.
It's interesting you mentioned your journey to the National Park Service. So many of us that like history live around it. I mean, I grew up in Philadelphia, and everywhere you turn, Philadelphia has colonial history, revolutionary history, even through the 19th century, the Underground Railroad, the Industrial Revolution. So you couldn't help but be exposed to history. And I think so many of us, because we have that exposure, really love it. And yet, in the 1970s and 80s, when both of us entered our career, the focus on history, particularly at the graduate level, was working with primary source documents and documents, underscored documents, and historiography or secondary interpretations. And when I went on to graduate school, that was a little stifling for me. And it's probably one of the reasons why, I didn't go on for a doctorate much later. And had I known a little bit more about museum studies, I probably would have gone into that field instead of traditional history, because you're dealing with material culture and artifacts, and it really piques the imagination much more. And that appears to me what you're talking about. It was that engagement, that direct engagement with the things of history that really piqued your curiosity and made you want to go into the field. Is that true?
For me, it was. It made the concrete element of museums, for me, is what is fun about history and about museums. That it's the real stuff, and it's not just dealing with theory. It's not just dealing with competing ideas, although that's all part of it. But I love going to museums. I love being a part of museums because of the real stuff that you get a chance to work with. And then even more so when you're in the museum field, the material culture field, we get a chance to handle it. Now, I have to wear white gloves when I do it because that's always the rule. But there's an immediacy and an intimacy with history and the people who created that history when you're able to see the things that they used. Of course, I worked out the Baseball Hall of Fame, and the opportunity to see the bats that Babe Ruth used, and quite honestly, the bat that Mike Schmidt used, and to be able to hold those is just a terrific privilege and an honor, and it reanimates my excitement and makes me want to see what I can do to help other people enjoy that same excitement.
Now, in the National Park Service, both in Colonial Park and Independence, you're really working in open air kind of museums. You're not dealing with the artifacts as much, or maybe you did it at Colonial. I know we weren't really allowed to at Independence Park. The preservationists and curators dealt with those types of things. But I'd imagine that your work was very different in the Senate Curator's office. How did your skills in the National Park Service and at the Senate Curator's office develop you or prepare you for what you're doing at the Hall of Fame now?
So a couple of things. One of them is that there's no substitute for one thing that if you're an interpretive ranger in a national park that you get a chance to do a whole lot of, and that's talk. And to talk to lots of people over lots of time about lots of different things. And if you were ever shy, if you were ever unsure about how to do this, if you were ever self-conscious, when you have the opportunity for years on end to spend all day talking to people, you get over it. And then that's just a great lesson that I was able to carry on a lot of different places, and then be able to talk about the things that I do and convey to others how important what we're doing is. And that was one of the things that happened at the Senate, was that there are a couple of historical rooms, but the work at the Senate is to take care of the history of the Senate, the paintings and sculptures and antique furnishings many of which, when you think about the antique furnishings, are being used every day. All of the desks and chairs on the Senate floor being used every day while history is being made. And so helping to convey to people that it's not just historical. These desks have been around. For instance, most of the desks in the Senate have been around since the desks were first ordered after the burning of Washington, D.C. in the United States Capitol. They had to replace the desks, and the desks that they have now are still the very same ones. So they're historic desks with new history being made all the time, and that was just terrific work to be able to share that with people. And then the recognition that, you could be when you're outside, as we were at Yorktown, or more inside, as we generally were at Philadelphia, or inside, as I was almost exclusively at the Senate, there are always new items and new ways to share what we're doing and how we're doing it, and the opportunity just to convey all different kinds of elements to the visitors who are coming, and trying to find that aspect which will excite them and motivate them and help them draw a connection from the past to their own present.
Mm-hmm. Now, many historians would kill to work in Washington, D.C., and for the U.S. Senate Curator's office.
Yeah.
You were one of the premier spots in the nation where American history unfolded and continues to unfold. You have unbelievable collections down there, like the Library of Congress. You got first-rate museums like the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to leave for Cooperstown, New York?
Well, it goes back to our first question, and it's that I always loved baseball, and I found out about a position while I was in Washington, that the curator of the curatorial position here at the Baseball Hall of Fame was open, and I had a couple of thoughts. One of them was I've always loved baseball. The second one was, by that time I had 14 years of experience. I had, while I was in Washington, got my master's in museum studies at George Washington University, and so I had the interest and love for the game, and I had the academic credentials now to place myself in a position to perhaps get this job, and lo and behold, I did, and I spent a whole winter here, and I realized that if I could stomach a winter up in central New York, then and still wanted to continue, then that would be great. I have to say one more thing, and it's a nod to the great time that I had there working in Philadelphia. There were a number of us on the National Park Service staff who loved going to baseball games, and this was the time of the vet, and so there were many, many times when we hopped on the Frankfurt L and got on the Broad Street line and went down, and my recollection is that it was about $4 or $5 to get in the game, and $4 or $5 for beer, and went up to the 700 level and watched Mike Schmidt play baseball, and it really reanimated my love for the game. To be able to see it again live, which I'd not been able to do for a while, and it reminded me of how much I really love baseball. And I got to tell you, Bill, still today, I find baseball on TV just not nearly as exciting as baseball in real life. And, right now they're talking about the shifts. It's like when you watch baseball on TV, I see a sweating pitcher and a sweating hitter. Back and forth, back and forth. I mean, I can see the pores in their face, but I can't see where the second baseman is playing, and I can't see where the third baseman is. And for me, being able to see all that is one of the great joys of baseball, and anticipating what's going to be happening. So that's kind of a long answer to the question that you asked. But all these things weave together, don't they?
Well, it's interesting because I agree with you. Being at the ballpark, nothing can match that. Sometimes I feel as if I'm being patronized by the announcers when I'm watching baseball on TV, telling me, how to analyze the game or what I should be thinking about the game. And after so many years of following, and I know what I'm looking for, and yet, just as you said, I can't see it because I'm not at the game. But it's also maybe one of the reasons I fell in love with catching, and now as I coach, I'm a pitching coach because so much of what you end up seeing on TV is the one-on-one between the pitcher and the batter. Now, I'm curious because of your allusion to that great era of Phillies baseball in the 1980s and Mike Schmidt, who was my hero growing up, and they're working at the Hall of Fame. Have you ever met him and had the opportunity to tell him that?
Oh, that's a great question, and the answer is I've not gotten a chance. I have gotten a chance to meet him. I have not gotten a chance to tell him that story, but after discussing it with you, I'm going to have to make sure that I have the chance to do that.
No, you really do. Mike is a wonderful person, and over the years, I'm very happy to have said that something very few people are able to do, which is befriend your childhood hero, and he is. He is a friend, and he's been on this podcast a couple of times already, and we've done some things together over the years, and I know he'd appreciate that. Listen, you've called your position as Curator of History and Research at the Hall of Fame the best job in the world.
Yes.
What makes it so?
Well, whenever you get a chance to combine things that you love and then get paid for it, that's just one of the things that makes it the best job in the world. And the fact that there are so many people who have great feeling and great passion for the topic, and who love coming up to Cooperstown to visit here. My job is halfway done when the people arrive, because they've come and they already know they're coming for a good time, and then my job is just to make sure that they have the opportunity to do that, and I get to research and write about baseball. Basically, that's my job, is to come in and on a day-to-day basis research and write about baseball and what's happening today in the baseball world, but also what has happened years ago, and often tying those links together. One of the things you mentioned, the exhibits that I have worked on. One of the exhibits that I'm working on right now, and perhaps we can get a chance to talk about it a little bit right now, and then a little bit more come the springtime, is an exhibit called Shoebox Treasures, which is an exhibit about baseball cards and the manufacture of baseball cards, but more importantly, the collecting and passion that baseball cards inspires in people. Now, can you believe that somebody's being paid to do that? It's like that's what makes this the greatest job in the world. Is not only do I get a chance to remember my old baseball cards and my own, but to collect the stories of others and their baseball cards, and then figure out ways to weave all of these stories together in ways that will be meaningful for folks who are coming and who have had a wide variety of experiences and different eras and different ages of their own baseball card passion.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up with, you mentioned your responsibility, but pick up with that because many of the listeners really don't know how a museum works. And you said, well, of course, you research and write history as Curator of History and Research. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what that means is that you're not only writing for the publications the Hall of Fame puts out, which I know you do because I've seen your work in them, but you're also writing scripts for the exhibits that go up, and you do have a very strong say in how those exhibits are designed. So let's just pick up with the Shoebox Treasures. Walk us through that from the beginning, Tina. Is this going to be a permanent exhibit, or is this going to be a temporary exhibit?
Right. This is going to be a permanent exhibit, and some fans who have been up to Cooperstown before may remember a sort of a wall of cards, so to speak, it just showed some baseball cards, but it didn't talk very much about either the manufacture of them or the collecting of them, it just showed some. And what we wanted to do, we had to take that exhibit down when we were doing some renovations. But one of the neat things about being here at the Hall is that people feel like they want to tell you what they like and what they don't like about the Hall and what they miss. And there were a lot of people that said, "Hey, baseball cards were an important part of my connection to baseball, and you are missing an opportunity when you have taken that old exhibit down but not replaced it with something." And so in response to visitor requests, and that's part of my job is, each year we sit down and figure out what we're going to do for the next several years. And several years ago, we said, you know what? We've gotten so many requests about the baseball card exhibit. What can we do? We need to replace it. We need to put something up. But what can we do that's a little bit more engaging and a little bit more meaningful than simply gluing up a couple of hundred baseball cards on a wall? And so what we'll do now is talk about the history of baseball cards as tobacco cards and the development of them, go through the Bowman and Topps baseball card wars and the Topps monopoly, and then into the free-for-all that were the 1980s, 90s, and beyond. But also talk about collecting, back when you collected and put them in a rubber band and threw them in a shoebox, hence the name of the title, when they would get clipped to the back of a bicycle, and so you could make the motorcycle noise. The guys who later on, once the cards became to be somewhat valuable in and of themselves, put them in binders. So talking about the value of cards, both as toys and then in their financial value, is all part of it as well. So getting a chance to investigate all these kinds of things, that's how we figured out what we wanted to do.
Now, what's interesting, I know when I was at Chester County Historical Society, we ran on a 3-month cycle, but most of our exhibits were temporary exhibits. I mean, there was a gallery that was just permanent, but most of the exhibits were temporary exhibits. Mm-hmm. So while one exhibit was being put up, there was another exhibit waiting that we were putting finishing touches on, waiting in the wings to go up, and then there was yet another exhibit where script was being written, and we were trying to gather together the artifacts and get the loans for artifacts we didn't have that would go up. But you're talking about a scheduling that's kind of a year or more out. Is that correct?
Yes. So we schedule for permanent exhibits, and we don't do much in the way of temporary exhibits, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But permanent exhibits are pricey, and so it requires enough lead time to raise the funds necessary for it. And so we don't do temporary exhibits very much, and when we do them on a year temporary. So if something comes up, we say, well, we'll do a temporary exhibit here, and it will be for a year, because we don't have here in Cooperstown, with about 1,800 people, very many people who are coming to the Hall of Fame on a regular basis, even when we have had multiple temporary exhibits in a single year. It just turns out that folks go, no, I think I'll come this year. And I don't feel the need to come a couple of times a year. And most of our visitors will come only every few years, those who do come back. For us, and we know this from all of our demographic studies, there are a lot of people who come to to the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown once in their lifetime. It's a journey. One of the great things I know about the Philadelphia area is that we constantly have folks, because it's such a short distance, about 4.5 hours, straight up the Northeast Extension, to come to Cooperstown on a regular basis. And we have a lot of people who come up every induction or every year, and because we are so proximate to Philadelphia.
Now, you do have, though, a regular group of people who come up every year, and those are the Hall of Famers who come to the induction ceremonies. Now, I'm interested in two things about them with regard to the exhibits in the Hall of Fame. do most of them go through it every year when they come through? And if they go through it, what are their favorite exhibits? Or do you ever hear complaints, well, I've already seen that, so I'm not going back?
Well, some of them do go through it each time they come. Mostly they like to come, to be perfectly honest. We have a very nice hors d'oeuvre setup that happens one evening during Hall of Fame weekend. It's the Saturday evening of it, and they get a chance to go. It's held in the Hall of Fame gallery, exclusively for Hall of Famers and their families, and they love just to get a chance to hang out and be together and see their plaques. Some of them will go up and see what's new, but for them, and you can understand this, what they really love doing is just hanging out with one another, because it's an amazingly exclusive club, and they know more than anybody else that the time, effort, and energy it took to become a Mike Schmidt, to become a Steve Carlton, and what they went through, and to get to the top, and then to work so hard to stay there, that they ended up being better than 99% of the baseball players who've ever played Major League Baseball. That's how you get into the Hall of Fame, by the way. There's only about 1% of the ball players that ever make it to the Hall of Fame, which means that you can't be better than 90% of them and get into the Hall, or even 95% of them to get into the Hall. It's the most exclusive sports hall that there is.
Now, one pleasant problem you have is that so many baseball players have donated their artifacts, their collections, or have willed it to those artifacts to the Hall of Fame. And Peter Clark once took me down into the bowels of the place and showed me. And my God, it's like a picnic place for somebody like me. The artifacts that are down there, but at the same time, when you have mostly permanent exhibits, I'd imagine it's difficult to be able to show a lot of those things. And I know we were very fortunate to have a loan agreement when at the Chester County Historical Society, when I was there, when we did an exhibit on the old Philadelphia A's, and probably about a quarter of the artifacts that we had were on loan from the Hall of Fame. Yeah. And I imagine that you do have those loan agreements with other institutions as well. But how do you manage all those collections when you got so much stuff that you might not ever really be able to show?
Well, like many museums that have permanent collections, we do. We have more than we can show at any one time. That's one of the great things about being a museum curator, and one of the great joys of my job is to go through our collection storage and find neat items that perhaps haven't been exhibited before, or if they were exhibited telling a different story. And so we are constantly here at the Hall of Fame rotating old artifacts out and putting new artifacts in, even if sometimes they're just new to us. So somebody will donate something, we have to confirm and verify that it is what it's supposed to be, but it gives us the chance to rotate something out. For instance, we have just been one of the relatives of Joe DiMaggio came by our museum this past summer, and she said, I was a little underwhelmed by the items that you have for Joe DiMaggio. And so we said, well, unfortunately, Joe donated, he donated many items, but it was at a time when we weren't very actively acquiring things. And so she's giving us some artifacts to be able to put on loan. And so we do borrow items. The other thing we do is just go into our own collections and go, here's a neat item from a ball player. A lot of the items for Viva Baseball were items that were used by Latin players back in the day that hadn't been on exhibit for a long time, but now we repurpose them as, instead of being, this is an artifact from a great player, it's like this is part of this long story of Latin ball players who wanted to make it big in the majors. And so telling a new story or telling a story in a new way and using old artifacts is one of the great things that I get a chance to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've just been talking primarily about material culture. That is artifacts like uniforms, baseballs, equipment, trophies, things of that sort. But there's a whole other area of the National Baseball Library that are documentary collections. And I know that researchers are permitted to access those collections through the Giamatti Research Center. But a couple questions. Number one, how do you define researchers? Do you have to have a PhD in history or be enrolled in a graduate program to have access to those documentary collections?
We are, Bill, we're very liberal in our interpretation of who a researcher is. And so a researcher includes all of those people, but it also includes a 10-year-old boy who has just found out about Darren Dalton, and he wants to find out more about him. And so when he comes to the Baseball Hall of Fame, he can say, "So what do you know about him?" And we'll be able to bring out a folder because we have a vertical file folders for every major leaguer who's ever played Major League Baseball. We have a photo file of him. We may have a biography of him, and so these are the kinds of things that everybody can get a chance to enjoy. We don't lend out our books here at the library, but anybody who has an interest in baseball, that means that they would like to sit down at a place besides their own computer and do some research, we call them a researcher. Even if it's just that they want to read some books that they've heard about but have never gotten a chance to see. As a museum guy, I prefer them staying out in the museum, but everybody has their goal for their trip to Cooperstown, and sometimes it's to get a chance to see perhaps a rare book that has been written by or about their favorite ball player.
Now, that's important that you mention that, because the National Baseball Hall of Fame, its collections and its library are not just dedicated specifically to Hall of Fame players. I mean, you can find information, like you said, on Darren Dalton. There's information on just about every ball player that played, and even minor league players. Is that correct? That's
right. We have information on Negro League players, on umpires, executives, the women who played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, notable minor leaguers. It is astounding to me, and was astounding to me when I got here back in '99, that it's so much more than Hall of Famers. It's all of baseball, and all things that touch on to baseball or that baseball touches onto, which really opens up the universe into just about anything that the curatorial team wants or that the visitor has decided that they would like to see. And like I say, we get lots of emails and comments when people come saying, "Hey, I thought that I would see X, Y, and Z. I don't see it." And we go, "You know what? That would be a great thing to add in." And so the next time we have an opportunity to work in that area, we do so.
Now, I have one last question for you, and I know I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it, because listeners are going to be saying, "But what exactly can I see when I go to the Hall of Fame?" And we already know one of the permanent exhibits is going to be Shoebox Treasures, which is a permanent exhibit on baseball cards. But if someone was to go into the museum and they'd start on the first floor, once they get out of the actual Hall of Fame where all the Hall of Famers plaques are,
yeah,
and you proceed through the building, can you tell us what permanent exhibits are up there on first, second, and third floors?
Sure, happy to do that. So in addition to the Hall of Fame gallery on the first floor, we also have our inductees row, which is where this year's inductees are highlighted. And so right now we have the inductees from this past year. We're getting ready to find out over the course of the next couple of months who next year's upcoming inductees are. There's just a slight chance that some relief pitcher from New York is going to be making it to the Hall of Fame. Mariano Rivera is almost assuredly going to be getting his pass punched here to the Hall. But then also on the first floor, we have a fine art gallery where we have everything from Norman Rockwell to Kadir Nelson, quite a wide range of styles and genre, and baseball has inspired a lot of people and a lot of artists. So we have this fine art gallery. When you go up to the second floor, we have a wonderful film. There's a locker room that has the history of all 30 teams for the past 10 years in it, so that as teams and players create history on the field, we're constantly working to obtain and acquire artifacts for this year in baseball, which then end up going into their lockers. A whole timeline of baseball, starting with the 19th century, continuing all the way up to today, and including things like a room devoted to Babe Ruth, another area that is devoted to the Negro Leagues and the African American experience called Pride and Passion. We have an exhibit about women in baseball. Those who have seen League of Their Own will remember that story, but it begins a long time before that and continues all the way up to today. So those are elements there. You've mentioned our Viva Baseball about Latin ball players. Then up on the third floor, we have a whole exhibit about ballparks and the records room, which talks about the baseball records, World Series. So there's really quite a lot for any fan of the game to find quite a bit for themselves, and it generally takes a number of hours to go through the museum. We also are aware that we have a lot of folks who love baseball who come, and there's a lot of folks who just love the people who love baseball, and part of our goal is to keep them entertained and enjoying their days as well.
We've been talking with John Odell, who is the Curator of History and Research for the National Baseball Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame museum is open 7 days a week. It's closed Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. And Labor Day through Memorial Day weekend, the hours are 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. If you are interested in doing research at the Giamatti Research Center, appointments are preferred. It is not open on weekends, but open Monday, Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. John, thank you very much for being with us on the podcast and for the wonderful work that you and all the staff at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Library do in preserving both baseball and America's past.
Oh, Bill, thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope we get a chance to do this again sometime.
Oh, we definitely will. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia Baseball, Past, Present, and Personal. This is Bill Cachetis, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.